Hi, I'm Colin Sutherland, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Geotab, and welcome to another issue of Connected with Geotab, where I'm interviewing executive guests on trending topics. Our goal for this podcast series is to create a connected community where listeners can locate a variety of topics and connect on ideas for this fast-paced business and economic reality we all find ourselves in today. And today, we are very lucky to have with us Dirk Schlimar, Chief Privacy Officer, though he wears many hats inside Geotab. Today, probably the relevant topic is Chief Privacy Officer and Executive Vice President for Geotab. Welcome, Dirk, to our conversation today.
Well, thanks, Colin. Glad to be on your show. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, we've known each other for several years now, and I remember when we started working together, it was in a very humble, smaller office facility, and we got to know each other and your leadership skills. But I thought maybe you could just walk through your past reflection, maybe even your past career as you came into Geotab and how you've seen the role of privacy and even data evolve since your earlier parts of your career and where we are today. And let's kind of warm up in that discussion, see how it goes.
Yeah, Colin. So thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit here. I'm originally from Germany. Went to law school in Germany, and almost people, it's like soccer a little bit. The Germans were always known to be very tight on data, and so seemed to be almost a natural there. But that's not where I started at all. When I first came to Canada, I worked for one of the actually premier manufacturing companies in Canada that was founded by an immigrant from Germany in 1950s, and very fast-growing company. When I joined them, it was around $300 million in sales, and then worked with the founder and took it to $1 billion in sales. The company was initially privately traded, then publicly traded, and so really interesting journey from a company and see how it grows, how it goes global, how it has to adapt its practices. And that's really what the background that I brought coming to Geotab, meeting Neil as an entrepreneur, and the family, meeting you at the time. And so really that was 50 people. I remember Geotab at the time. Now it's 1250, and really it was an opportunity to make a contribution for Geotab to really, as it took off, to bring some of those learnings that I had to Geotab, and data was really incidental to it. So this is not where it started, but it became more and more important to have a professional framework in a number of areas, and I would say data is one of the key areas where you want a solid framework, because it's our end users, our end customers who entrust us with their data, and that understanding is really foundational. It's not our data, it's somebody else who entrusts their data to us. And so to build that framework and design that framework has been super interesting, and really allowed me to, if you will, retool from what was manufacturing, and here it was data. So that has been super interesting.
I wonder, because the title Chief Privacy Officer, it's not Chief Data Officer, it's Chief Privacy Officer. So data and privacy go hand in glove today, but just maybe broadly, what is the Chief Privacy Officer's role? What do we all have to keep private? Where does all that fit into a corporation?
No. So a good question. The reason why Geotab initially started having a Chief Privacy Officer is because we needed one. And so I remember one of our early data processing agreements we made with a company in Germany. You had to fill in who is your, the Germans use the term, who's your data protection officer, right? You needed somebody. And as you know, how it goes at Geotab, hey, you ask a question, you're it. And so this is what happened. We needed somebody. That's where the, if you will, formal appointment came from, but then it quickly broadened from there. And it's really that you have to have a good idea of what data do you really have, how is it used, where does it flow, so you get a handle on your data. You understand where it is, who has it for what purpose, and that's really what it's all about, to have a really solid grasp of what your data governance, to use a big word, what your data governance is.
Well, I want to talk about data governance in a while, because I think that's a really important topic. I wanted to talk about globalization because you mentioned a couple of times, the background of Germany and some of the deals that we were writing in Europe that maybe forced a discussion. From a multinational perspective, of course, every country has its own set of guidelines, guiding rules. We're in Canada, United States has maybe a separate set versus Germany, but maybe you could provide just your thoughts, or even, if you will, even a best practice that we could share with our customers that might be considering data policy. Is there such a thing as a global standard, or how would you even begin to start thinking about creating for a global company a standard around how you handle data?
Yeah, and there have been some developments. It's true. The whole idea of data privacy was much more pronounced in Europe for a long time, specifically in Germany, specifically for historic reasons. In Germany has always had, since the Second World War, a very strong data privacy culture. But what has happened, while it used to be a unique aspect to maybe Germany and Europe, it now has been introduced more and more, and had to become much more part of our thinking in North America as well, especially after Cambridge Analytica, a scandal that our listeners are very, very familiar with. And probably the notable development is the California Consumer Privacy Act, where now you have a European-style privacy regime also in California. And we know this from the transportation industry, we know it from the car industry. Whatever happens in California really has an impact nationwide in the US. And so that's what has happened. The idea of data privacy protection that has been around in Europe now has come to the United States as well, in form of the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. And so what that means is we need to be much more aware of the basics. And I teach in the directors education program at the University of Toronto. So those are people who sit on board of directors, and they have always been teaching financial literacy, right? As directors have to be financially literate, a key part of corporate director education. And then comes this idea of data being the new gold, and we can talk about that. But then I realized, no, you need data literacy. If data truly is the new gold, and you expect your board and your senior executives to be financially literate, you also have to be data literate. And that starts with an understanding on who are the people, who are the players in the world of data privacy. You ask, where do you start? And that brings us back to some key distinctions that you and I have talked about a lot. And so they remember is that data in the data privacy context is not a corporate asset, but data is really, from a privacy perspective, whose data are you protecting? And it's it's you and my privacy. It's a data, private data is data about individuals, and these individuals are known as data subjects. And so we need to keep that in mind. So ultimately, in our context of fleet management and transportation, is drivers, is passengers in vehicles. So those are the data subjects. Then the others are the data controller. Those are the people who take that data and do something with it for their own business, purposes. So if you say you're applying for a job, you send me your resume. Now I have a lot of personal data about you. I have your resume that tells me a lot about you. And so that personal data, I'm now using it to make an employment decision, potentially about you. So I'm a data controller. I'm using this data for my own purposes. And then later on, you may give me your social insurance number or other data about you that I give to a payroll provider. And so I give that to somebody else who's helping me process that data, and that would be a data processor. So the data subjects, the controllers, and the processors are the players in this. And sometimes it's not easy to figure out who is who. Am I a data controller? Am I a data processor? Who are my data subjects? And so the first thing would be to get clarity on who am I in that world of data protection, and then what data do I have? What types of data do I have? And some may be really primary for my business. So in our case, it's vehicle-generated data. A lot of discussions revolves around that. But I may have other data. In marketing, you have data about leads. In HR, you have data about a job. People are looking for a job, and so it's keeping those things apart and understanding who you are and what data you have is where data literacy starts.
And I guess I know that when we're speaking with each other on the legal side and we're trying to work on contracts together with our partners and customers, just the clear definition of a data subject, a processor, and a controller just helps that whole legal contracting program go forward quicker and more clearly, because we're clearly distinguishing those three different parties.
Yeah, and Colin, to maybe another distinction we can make here, and you bring this idea of contracting. This is really what I've learned is a lot is built on trust, right? Do people have a sense that when I entrust my data to you, it's properly handled, and therefore having proper policies in place, having those documented strongly, being able to provide that documentation proactively. I've learned over the years that creates a lot of trust. And there are two things that, again, we should look at separately. The one is data security. That is, how is the data secured? That's a very technical analysis. But then also having that properly documented, so you can hand it to somebody and saying, hey, here's how our data security and how it works. And then here's data privacy. What do I actually do with the data? For what purpose is it used? How is it handled, and how are those decisions made? That would be the other side of it, right? So there is the data security side, and then the data privacy side on how do I handle the data that I have. And the more those things are clearly explained, are documented, documentation is being kept up to date. It's not like sometimes we get those things, they probably wrote this 5 years ago, right? Some of the terminology has changed and they haven't maybe kept up, but having a first documentation and then curating that document, keeping it up to date, we've learned that builds a lot of confidence with our partners.
Okay, now back to the other word you use, data governance. So if we use this package called data governance, I'm assuming that includes a clear definition of the subject and the controller and the processor, and possibly even how the security is being handled. But does it also include the idea of freedom to operate, or how far can I now work with all that data? Now that I've defined all these different people and where the data is being generated and how we can process it and use it, how do we bring in the idea of, am I actually able to do something with this data now? If I'm a business owner, if I'm a client of ours, because it sounds very scary, right? When this idea of all these parties, and if you blow it, it's a pretty big mistake if you blow data privacy. So you don't want to blow it. So how do I know what freedom I actually have, and how do I feel comfortable with that from my customer?
Yeah, no. So Colin, again, excellent question, and we have to be. I believe we have to be quite clear that there is an inherent tension between privacy and the data-driven economy. Right? I mean, there's many good things we can do with data, and while we do that, though, we have to look at data privacy laws that want to inherently restrict what we do with data. And there's no point talking around it. Those are two principles that are at odds with each other and that are competing with each other. And I think for Europe and the United States, North America continue to innovate, we have to realize the more privacy restrictions we bring in, the harder it will get for our respective economies to compete globally, which means maybe the center of innovation now moves to Asia, may move to China, may move to Southeast Asia, may move to Japan. And so policymakers, I believe, have to be cognizant of that. We have a global economy. We believe that Silicon Valley has been more successful than Europe because Europe had very strict data privacy laws all along, and so it hasn't been easy to be started in Europe. And now you're bringing this to Silicon Valley. So we know there is a we know there is a tension. But there is a concept in the European data laws. It's called legitimate purpose, right? And so this is really thinking about, am I using this data for a legitimate purpose to run my business, and is it reasonable to use data in this way? And so it's really to think about, what am I using it for? And would we say, yeah, for the safety of my drivers, for the efficiency of my business, for the productivity of my business. If you think about electric vehicles, I need a lot of information where the driver is concerned. Hey, yeah, I want to know what is my range. I may have range anxiety, and data delivers me that information. And so if I keep that in mind, that purpose in mind, what is actually being used for, and that's a legitimate purpose, then we can work with data, and then give some thought to, do I need all of this data? Can I, so for example, if I'm a fleet manager, no, I don't give access to everybody to each data point, but I'm giving it to the people who need to have access to it. And so you hear the thing, privacy by design. Again, another big word, but in the Geotab world, what privacy by design means, I can create groups. And if I create groups, then certain managers have access to certain information. And we know that's how the Geotab system has been built, but this goes by privacy by design. Not everybody needs to see everything, and I build that into the solution. And if the access controls are more granular and can explain why this manager has access to this information, then I'm doing what the privacy laws are asking me to do, which is I'm designing privacy thinking into the solution. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because often people think about it in terms of consent, but we know that consent can be very useful, but how often do we just click it, ask, hey, do you consent? And I click it and I haven't read it because I just want to get to where I want to be, right? And so consent can be super important. It is super important, but sometimes consent is a bit of a fiction, right? If you think about also an employment setting where my employer asks me, do you consent to the use of your data here? And yeah, I want to keep my job. So yes, I click consent. And so consent thinking is very useful, but having this idea of what is it used for, is that legitimate? Can I say, yeah, that's a legitimate business purpose, how I'm using the data? That goes a long way, and that's a principle that's known under the European privacy laws. And I think it's a principle that's useful as we think about data usage globally.
You reflected on Silicon Valley, and I think in ways heard Silicon Valley being accused of being so entrepreneurial in the topic of data and all those cool things you can do with data that, quite frankly, Congress in Washington can't keep up with the innovation. So there's this connection between all that incredible innovation going on. And quite frankly, there may not be a law that says to Silicon Valley, you can't do that yet. So just talk to me about, like, how firm ground do you think we're on today in terms of, we're making judgment calls in our company, businesses are making judgment calls on what they think is the right approach to handle data from a privacy perspective and just have some general data policies. But I think the caveat is always they should be aware that we're not on solid ground here. Things are still evolving in Washington and around the world. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah. So things are still evolving, and because even when when new laws are being introduced, you don't know right away what they mean, right? Because it takes court decisions around this interpretation of the law by data protection authorities or the Attorney General and general industry practice. So it's to think I can just open the law book and it would tell me what I can and cannot do. It's not how it works, especially as innovation outpaces the things that the lawmakers were thinking about. So you're absolutely right. So there is a tremendous amount of judgment that is involved. And so there is a saying in the legal business, bad cases make bad law, right? So if somebody does something that's really irresponsible and that becomes known, like Cambridge Analytica, you have now this backlash that you're dealing with, and so what that means for an individual company, don't be that company, right? So don't be the company that brings us a bad case that makes a bad law. And so what we do at Geotab, we have a number of approaches how we do that. So first of all, of course, we do look at what do these privacy law means, what do they require of us, and I come back to that very often. It's a requirement to document. And so we have that documentation in place. It's a requirement to understand the roles of the various parties. And so we have that in place. And that's why we always ask for a data flow diagram. Sometimes there's innovative ideas of programs we may be putting together with our customers. And the first thing that we'll ask, well, hey, show me the data flows, right? Show me how it works. And that is critical. So the Geotab legal team won an award for under the European data protection implementation when it came out, the GDPR, the new European data law. They were looking at, hey, who has done well in implementing this law? And the Geotab legal team, I must say, proudly say, won an award for that. And why did we win that award? Because we're not just a bunch of lawyers, but we had engineers on the team who understand how it really works. Not just here's how it should work and here's how the paper says it works. No, they go into the business, into the application, into support engineering, into development engineering, say, hey, what do you actually do? So understanding how it works is critical. And so I would say for any of our partners, if you are the chief privacy officer or a person who's part of the privacy team, you cannot be in isolation. You need to be close to the business. You need to know how it works, and that would be critical. Then you need to have it properly documented, and then you have to have a sanity check. So we have a bit of a committee that meets quarterly and that looks as innovative data uses and say, hey, how would I feel? And so it's perfectly lines up with our guidelines, and so we're looking good here. But if I was now a customer, if I was a fleet owner, if this was my data that is being used in that way, would I think, yeah, that's a good use of data, and you're trying to put us into their shoes. So we have the sanity check, if you will, at the end. Sometimes it's the front page of the newspaper check. If this was in front of a magazine or industry magazine saying Geotab does this, would we say, yeah, that's exactly what we do, and we feel good about what we do, and we think we're serving our customers by doing like this. We are obeying the privacy laws, so we have that check after the fact that we're saying, yeah, this is probably a good use, and we're applying our judgment there. So understanding how it works is key, documentation is key, and then the after the fact sanity check, I think, is just as important.
Neil, our CEO, has often said that the topic of data, and you mentioned that consent is kind of one of those red herrings, right? You consent, but what are you really consenting to?
At some level.
At some level. Thank you. He said the one thing about data is that you can't ever destroy it. So you can create data. From the moment you create data, it's out there. Now, you could own it. You could think you own that data for a period of time, but it could be around for 100 years from now, long after I'm off of the planet, any data that I'm creating today. So the idea of data, and then as it gets older, or maybe it becomes anonymized, how do data and privacy people think of, is there a timeline at which data from the moment of creation through the ages that it changes the definition, or is it a pool or aggregate? Like how do you guys think about this stuff?
So again, there is people saying, hey, this data can be deleted, and I'm looking at my PC here, and there is a delete button, right? And so I might think, hey, if I hit that delete button now, it's deleted. No. What it means in case of my computer, if I had a Word document, now we don't have, we like to use Google at Geotab, but say if I had a Word document, it's not deleted from the computer. We know it goes into the recycling bin, right? And so this is where it starts, where I may not know this. I thought I hit the delete button and now this data is gone. No, all that has happened is it has been moved to the recycling bin. And once in a while, then I have to empty that recycling bin. And so this goes back to how it works and to documentation. So we explain in our technical and organizational measure statement, we explain exactly what happens when you hit the delete button. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And so sometimes there's this idea of, does it mean total destruction, or does it mean something else? And so again, to be credible, and you see how I come back to that, right? To be a credible player in the data economy, you have to have clarity and documentation on this. Not say, oh yeah, the data is deleted, and hope nobody asks you what that means. And then when you do, say, well, so no. Here's what that means, and potentially here's what it does not mean, because there are, as you said, there sometimes aren't the absolutes that we're looking for. But for that, we do have standards and we do have protocols, and so we can explain, if you hit the delete button, if you purge the data from the Geotab system, for example, here's what that means, and then you can talk to our technical people if you have questions about that. Comes back to documentation and understanding what happens.
Let's talk about connected cars for a second. I know how much you love connected cars. Connected cars in Europe, connected cars in North America, it doesn't matter. Connected cars. Cars are data generating objects today, creating fault codes, you name it. I want to speak about connected cars from the let's educate the fleet manager in what a connected car end user agreement is. Because before, the fleet manager may have procured that vehicle on the back of the cost, the 7-year replacement cycle, maybe the maintenance costs, and it was very much in terms of how much is this vehicle going to cost me to own, operate, and eventually remarket. And now this thing comes in play, which is this software agreement that may exist in the car that you're about to purchase. What advice would you have for a fleet manager just to start to prepare themselves for this connected car reality? Just become a wise buyer of cars, knowing that car has probably got a cellular modem and some data collection going on inside.
Yeah. So first of all, I think we need to understand that in order to compete in the today's economy and the economy of future, data plays a larger role, right? And so this is, we talked about data being the new gold, and I remember, again, the comparison to the finances. I remember being in a finance course, and you know, people say cash is king, and then the finance professor says, no, cash is oxygen. Right? Your company can't even, you know, if you run out of cash, it's over. And so I believe the same applies to data. Data is oxygen. You need to understand what's going on in your business based on data inputs that come from your assets. In this case, it comes from the vehicle. You will need that more and more. It's also the input for innovating, for connecting to other services. People come with new ideas, with new services around your vehicle, and so to take advantage of those services, you need data. The other thing is, and again, stepping back a little bit, telematics, what we do, fleet management, it has been described as the entry level kind of data, bringing your company into the data age, right? If you say, hey, where can I start to, you know, like, I know I need to be a data-driven business, where do I start? Well, actually, your fleet is a great way to start, because this is where connectivity and IoT and all the buzzwords that maybe are now around for 4 to 5 years have been around for 20 years. The things weren't called that when you co-founded Geotab with Neil. We didn't call it that, but that's what it was. So it's actually telematics or fleet management is a very mature application of the data-driven economy in the transportation sector. So you absolutely want to start here and saying, for me to stay with the modern economy, I need to have the vehicles that are connected to take advantage of some best practices that are already built into the Geotab product, where you can take advantage from the learning that others had that have been built into this, where it's making certain suggestions on how you should run your fleet, and then also where you stay in touch with or help drive the data economy. So I would believe that connecting your fleet today is absolutely essential to stay relevant and to be able to compete, and then to take advantage. So if you look at some of the Geotab data insights are based on a massive installed base where the benefits come back to all the individual fleet owners, and you're able to take advantage of insights that comes from a much larger group of vehicles. So your connected car actually keeps you connected to the state of the art in transportation, allows you to stay connected to innovation. And even as a maybe smaller company, you can compete with the larger companies. At least you're not right away they're connected and you're not. I think if you're there, it really puts you forward. And again, it's a very practical entry into the world of data in business. The key thing is that fleet management is an area where use of data is relatively mature. Goes way back. You have been part of the industry from truly from the early days, and so it's really an area in a company where you have a very practical entry into what it means to be a data-driven business.
I can see this conflict of interest that gets set up though between, like let's say at a government level, you can see the AI work that China is doing specifically. Phenomenal work in artificial intelligence, world leading by far. And that you can see in the United States, you see Silicon Valley doing some work with AI, but you can see that our government needs to go and create laws that protect citizens, which is perhaps going to make it less agile or less competitive in that world of AI. Same thing for the car makers, where you've got big car makers who at a macro level absolutely need to compete for share of market. And they know that getting the more data that they can get from their own vehicles helps them compete more effectively versus the other brands. And yet you've got to take that step back. What is the right thing to do, right? You've got to take that big step back and decide, are you going to allow one competitor to run forward based on their, maybe it's a country value. Yeah, that country can go and do what they need to do, but they're not going to export that work globally and vice versa. It's a real challenge. You can see the competitive edge that data gives companies or governments in terms of creating new economies and new wealth. But now you've got this overarching need at the local level, right? And it's an interesting challenge, I think, for businesses and governments and competitors to figure out.
Yeah. So and Colin, maybe I'm not sure whether this was a comment or a question, but I will comment anyways. Right? And this is, to me, we have talked about this a few times now, and this is issue of trusting my data to somebody else. And for Geotab, that means we have to be trustworthy, right? If somebody entrusts their data to us, we have to be trustworthy. You mentioned earlier end user agreement. From the get-go, we have been writing our end user agreement in a way that we truly think is fair and is balanced. That I'm not hoping, they're not going to read this anyway, and I'm putting all kind of things in there. We have had feedback from our resellers over the years, feedback from end customers over the years, where someone says, I really don't like this clause in your end user agreement. And we say, you know what, if you don't like it, let's look into it. And maybe it shouldn't be in there, not just for you, but maybe it shouldn't be in there for anybody. And so over the years, we have updated the end user agreement based on feedback, because we didn't just want to then do it for one person. If it's not the right thing, then we have to do it better. So being trustworthy, because there is a lot of trust when it comes to data, I think is critical in this industry. And then again, the point that you mentioned, there is a dichotomy here between competitiveness and innovation on the one hand, and privacy on the other hand. But we have to realize that if as a country or as a hemisphere, no matter how you want to call it, if we want to stay competitive, data is a raw material with which you are competitive. And then to find practical and pragmatic solutions to protect privacy at the same time. And so that's something I think we will continue to grapple with as this economy advances. Now, I would say we're having this chat here. You didn't have a podcast like this before COVID-19, right? You're having it now. We're doing new things now we didn't do before. We're working differently as we did before, and so we have seen, I think, across the board that digital push, right, where now people are working from home, and now things are being delivered, and things are being delivered contact free, and so we see the benefit of data-enabled technologies, right? And I think we need to make that case and saying, look, this is what's being enabled, and then let's not do it irresponsibly. Let's avoid making bad law out of bad cases. But I think the situation we're in right now shows what can be done and how it can be helpful. And I think it's up to us to explain that and explain that to policymakers as well.
I guess that's the benefit. You're right, Dirk. Rather than having you speak at our Connect conference for 30 minutes on stage to an audience of 300 or 400, now you get to go and record your thoughts for everybody. And this is, 2 years from now, people can listen to this podcast backwards, but and sort of reflect on. This is a snapshot. We should say that this is June 29th, 2020. So, hey, when you're listening to this in June 2021, you're reflecting back. Let's talk about the difference between life then and now.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a fleet manager and you're just trying to, you hear what we're saying, you can grasp the concepts. Where do I get started? Like, what do I learn? How do I just make sure that I'm at least feeling out this vocabulary for maybe my personal life or my business career? What advice would you have, apart from just call a lawyer who's a great data lawyer? What can you do to empower yourself to become more educated on the topic?
Yeah, so I find, if it's a new area, I would just enroll in. There are, and maybe we can make it available separately from this. I would have a basic education from somebody, right? So instead of, so you're saying how do we work with your lawyers? No, don't give me the paperwork. Explain it to me, right? Explain the big picture to me. Explain how the big picture relates to my business, and explain to me where should I start, right? And so most likely this will be again the assessment. What data do I have, right? What is my fleet data? Categorize it in some way. What is the purpose for using that data? And maybe ask a few questions where you're saying, here we're using the solution for a certain purpose. So could somebody take exception to that, right? Ask some of those questions. And I think that's where you start. And that's why I think, again, this idea of legitimate purpose, if you believe somebody came and were to expose how you manage your business with that data, would you feel, yeah, I can explain what I do. I have good thought, good quality thinking behind all of these uses. I have, again, documented that. It comes back to that, right? That we're saying, I know what data I use. I know what I use it for. I have listed the purpose, and this is why I think the Geotab pillars that we have, they help with that. They really identify 6 different legitimate purposes for which data can be used in a fleet. And so look at those and use those for the purpose of explaining what it is that you do with data. Maybe that's the start. That's the starting point.
So I know you're not, as a lawyer or as a person that's in our legal department in privacy, you're never going to give me what's going to happen in the future, because lawyers just, you will never predict the future for me. But I do want to ask you, here we are almost July 2020. What excites you about the next, 12 to 24 months in the world of data and the world of privacy? What is really exciting? What is exciting you right now about what's going on and what you see coming up in the future?
Yeah. So, Colin, I would say truly, and as I've mentioned it before, if we call it the post-COVID economy, if we call it the distance economy, whatever we're going to call it, data will be critical to enable that economy. And even if I think about the crisis right now, and we have seen that as we read about this, where I've read articles saying, hey, if COVID had happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago, not like 50 or 100 years ago, but even 10 and 15 years ago, it would have been some of the digital tools that we have available now, we would have been missing those. And so I think there has been a push where the value of those things has become manifest, and so I think it's going to accelerate really what's possible. So that would be the one thing. And then on the other hand, we have to realize technology and data can be used for good and it can be used for ill. And I think we need to have a much higher quality dialogue about that. If I have the privacy at all cost people over here and the innovation at all cost people over there, that's not a good way to handle this, right? And so it's no, I have two competing principles, and how do I bring these together? The hard question is the how question. How can I do both? How can I innovate? And how can I protect privacy properly? And so to be much better at collaborating, bringing those different viewpoints and not seeing myself in one camp or the other, but acknowledging their legitimacy to both ideas and bring that together and create practical solution. I think that's going to be from where I am. So they see technology advancements, that those are software development, and that's people like Neil, they're going to drive that. But the societal dialogue around that, the benefit, the proper use, that's what I'm interested in. And if we can elevate the quality of the debate and have it less polarized with more understanding on each side, and then again being trustworthy on each side, that's something that's excites me to contribute to the quality of dialogue around those. Some of these issues can be very difficult, and elevate the quality of debate. That's something that excites me. Yeah.
Dirk, thank you for spending the time with me today. It's been, I think you've actually done a great job just putting in plain language, I think, some pretty heavy discussion that we've had. But I think hopefully for the folks that are listening in, that they found it insightful and maybe some good places to move forward. And thank you for that summary. I want to remind our listeners and thank them for joining another episode of Connected with Geotab. And to stay up to date with Geotab and everything Geotab, go to the geotab.com website, go to our blog website, and also visit the Geotab community, where there's questions and answers. And maybe you have some questions that we've discussed today. You want to enter your questions right into our community site, and we'll have answers for you. Maybe Dirk personally will answer your question in the community site, and that'll be fantastic. So until the next episode of Connected with Geotab, thank you. And thank you, Dirk, for being our guest today. Thank you very, very much.
It's been great. Thanks for having me on the show, Colin. Okay, take care.
Thank you.